Hello, this is my first video, and I'm going to be talking about The Art of War. I just thought I'd kind of go through it basically line by line and give some thoughts about each one, to help us study The Art of War, because I think a lot of times people might read The Art of War, but they read it like it's a normal Western book where you can just read entire chapters in a day, and it's really not like that. It's more like something where you have to read a chapter and then spend, an entire day thinking about the next chapter. Or sorry, not even a chapter. You have to read a line and then spend an entire day thinking about that line because it is so dense and so profound and so deep. Um, so let's dive into it. The opening line: "War is of vital importance to the state. The province of life or death, the road to survival or ruin. It is mandatory that it be thoroughly studied." So this is a pretty nice opening, but in terms of thinking about it, one of the things I want us to think about is to contrast it with von Clausewitz's famous book on war, because in his opening chapter, he opens by giving a definition of war. I actually, a few years ago, I was listening to a podcast, and this person was like, Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz on the nature of war. And that was the title of the podcast. And I clicked on it. I went to go listen to it because it sounded really interesting. They clearly have very different, orientations towards how you should fight and towards, what war is and how it is conducted. But he gave that as a definition of war. And I looked at that and I said, well, that's not a definition. It doesn't actually, it just says that war is important. Lots of things are important. The harvest is important. The harvest is not war, right? But then I thought about it some more and I said, but it's really profound that it isn't a definition, because I thought, there's really two ways you can start a treatise on war. You can start by defining war. You can start by saying war is this and it isn't this. Or you can start by contextualizing war. And I think when you contextualize war as opposed to defining it, you get a lot of the features that make Sun Tzu so profound and so important for the modern day. Von Clausewitz started out, he defined war. He said, war is therefore an act of violence to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. He later on also then said, war is the continuation of politics by other means, and that's why it's not just, unseen amounts of violence, why it has limitations, why you can't just, use nukes every time you get into a fight. But he really starts out by drawing a dividing line between war and what the war is trying to accomplish. But Sun Tzu isn't about that. Sun Tzu doesn't want to do that. Sun Tzu wants the reader to think of the strategist first and foremost as a servant of the state, as a servant of the political entity. And so first and foremost, it is the job of the strategist to think about what is good for their nation, for their country. And then second of all, to really to think about, maybe the technicalities of war, right? And to always keep in mind the context of war. So, for example, I wanted to bring up an example from The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. If you want an auxiliary book that's sort of more of a book to read with The Art of War, by the way, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms is a really great book to read. I'm going through it right now. But one of the things that really struck me was is chapter 7. This general named Yuan Shao he's trying to secure a base of supplies. Now, the base of supplies is currently controlled by someone who is basically sort of allied with him, but not under his control. And he decides that this isn't good enough. He needs to actually control this base of supplies. And so what he does, instead of marching army, at first he thinks like, okay, I should march an army in and secure this base of supplies by attacking this person, even though he's my ally. But then one of his advisors says, no, I have a better idea. You see, there's a general on the other side of this base of supplies, and what you should do is you should send a secret message to that person saying, hey, I'm going to attack, how about you attack, and we can split this base right down the middle. So we'll both have access to supplies. But then when this enemy goes to, when this other general, this third party goes to attack, that'll force the person who's sort of your ally to ask for help, and that will allow you to basically throw a coup. And so that's what he does. He sends the secret message, the third general attacks, third party attacks, and then suddenly he is basically given control of the base of supplies, and he basically exiles the person who was previously running it. This is really important to think about, particularly in the modern day, because we have a modern example of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? The Russians started the war. Their premise was to prevent the Ukrainians from joining NATO. But the problem is that by invading Ukraine, they basically made themselves into that third party, where because they were being aggressive, because they were attacking, then everyone had to seek more protection. Everyone in the region suddenly had to seek more protection. And suddenly the American power and prestige and influence skyrocketed. And America, Europe went from an area that was like sort of on, iffy, to being very enthusiastic about, this American-led world order. And you have, Finland joining NATO and Sweden trying to join NATO. So that's definitely a thing to think about, particularly also when you think about the Taiwan Straits potential conflict. If China decides to attack Taiwan, you also need to think about the fact that that will drive the Taiwanese further into the American corner, and the fact that China has been threatening to do that ensures, in a weird way, ensures American influence and American leadership in the area by driving the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Taiwanese, and even now the Filipinos, who, because of their colonial history with the Americans, are kind of, the people you would expect to be lukewarm on American influence, to be giving Americans basing rights. And so you can see how really Sun Tzu teaches us that we need to not only look at the war and say, okay, is this war going to be successful or a failure, but also ask, what are the effects of this war, and how does this war serve the greater interests of the nation and the interests of the state? Because even if China, let's say China invaded Taiwan and they were massively successful, they achieved complete surprise, got their entire 2 million man army in there in a day, and the Taiwanese just collapsed. You could argue that that would actually ensure American supremacy and completely doom the Chinese, because the sanctions and the trade isolation, even just the trade isolation from there being a conflict in their near seas, would completely crash their economy, and suddenly every country in Asia would turn in a way that they probably never would have before to American leadership and American security guarantees. I've also had it pointed out to me that the Japanese and the South Koreans would probably go nuclear if the Taiwanese did not manage to go nuclear as they were learning about the potential invasion. So it definitely would massively backfire, and I suppose that's the reason the Chinese shouldn't do it. Yeah. I was, I'm sort of a Westerner, and so I was thinking about this in terms of, if you were to, and sort of building off that podcast, if you were sort of to give a definition of war, or talk about what war is from sort of a Sun Tzuian perspective, what you would say it is. And what I basically came up with, or sort of more what we're studying, what I basically came up with is that if you look at, history and philosophy and stuff, there are certain things we study that relate to how large groups of people organize themselves. So law, politics, diplomacy, economics, all of those things. Um, and what we're studying in the art of war, what military philosophy concerns itself with, is irregular changes to those. Now, I say irregular because all of those systems, usually, if they're at all good, they have some sort of built-in mechanism for change. A political system has elections, or if it's a monarchy, it has a fixed line of succession. Economics have business cycles, and they have ways to found businesses and declare bankruptcy. Diplomacy, you can sign treaties and so on and so forth. But when you're talking about war, when you're talking about military philosophy, you're studying changes that are outside of those fixed norms, changes that occur in ways in which we haven't planned for. And so Sun Tzu would say, a Sun Tzuian perspective on military philosophy would say, well, you can't say that it's beyond the scope of military philosophy if no one fires a shot. That is still within the scope of military philosophy, particularly what I just mentioned was basically a coup. Western military philosophies tend to ignore coups because no one is actually shooting at each other if the coup goes well. But a Sun Tzuian perspective, you do look at coups because that is a legitimate change and a legitimate thing you need to be concerned about when you're designing your military. You also are concerned with things like mass strikes, economic sanctions, espionage. He has an entire chapter on espionage. And so it's much more expansive. But, and sort of bringing up a last point, it's much more applicable to civilians. I think a lot of times people look at military philosophy and they say, well, that's just for military officers, or that's just for people in the armed forces or people in defense industry. It's kind of a niche interest, they feel, if you're interested in military philosophy and you're not doing any of those. But Sun Tzu would wholeheartedly disagree, because if you're a citizen of a country, or if you're a political decision maker in any way, and if you're from a democratic country, you are a political decision maker, then the art of war is actually addressed to you. You should remember that the art of war was actually not written for other military philosophers. It was written for the Lord that Sun Tzu was trying to enter the service of. And so the art of war is written for you because it's written to explain military matters so that you can understand what is going on and you can understand who is a good general, and how military affairs should be treated. So that's what I wanted to throw out there, and like and subscribe to the video. This is my first video I've ever made, and I'm kind of just throwing this out there. So if you have any comments about how I can improve this, I'll try my best. I am very much an amateur at making videos, so thanks.